In the last lesson, we learned that argument passages on the GRE contain a body, question stem, and 5 multiple choice answers. We also learned that argument passages typically consist of premises, unstated assumptions, and conclusions. When tackling argument questions, it's very important to be able to identify the various components of each argument. So in this lesson, we'll practice dissecting arguments by identifying and summarizing the premises, the conclusion, and any unstated assumptions. Let's begin with this argument. At this point, you may want to pause the video and take a moment to summarize the conclusion, premises, and any assumptions before continuing. Now, since the purpose of any argument is to convince the reader of a particular conclusion, you should always give the conclusion your greatest attention. As such, goal number 1 when reading any argument is to identify the conclusion. As you read an argument, you should ask yourself, is this what the author is trying to convince me of? Now, in this argument, we find the conclusion at the end. The author is trying to convince us that Judy must be nice, so we might summarize the conclusion as follows. Throughout this lesson, your summaries will often be different from mine, and that's totally okay. The goal, however, is to use as few words as possible to summarize the argument. All that matters is that you can understand your summaries later on. Okay, now that we've identified the conclusion, what evidence does the author use to support that conclusion? These are the premises. One premise can be found here. Every hockey fan I know is nice. We might summarize this premise as follows. Another premise used in the argument is here. I do not know Judy. We might summarize this premise like this. The last premise in the argument is here, which basically tells us that Judy's wearing a hockey jersey, which we might summarize like this. Now that we've summarized the given argument, we should never have to return to the original argument since all of the necessary information is contained within the summary. Okay, now before we go looking for assumptions, let's examine what we have so far. Does this seem like a very strong argument? In other words, how well does the conclusion follow from the premises? Well, like most arguments on the GRE, this argument is most certainly not perfect. Sure, it's possible that Judy's nice, but it's also quite possible that she isn't. As you can see, the author has made a pretty big leap from the given premises to the conclusion. This leap consists of several unstated assumptions that the author has made. Let's try to identify some of them. Remember, an assumption is an unstated premise that is absolutely necessary in order for the conclusion to be drawn. One assumption is that hockey fans that I know are representative of all hockey fans. Another assumption is that wearing a hockey jersey makes a person a fan. Now, this argument probably has several more unstated assumptions that are necessary for the conclusion to be drawn, and that's okay. Our goal at the moment is to get a feel for finding assumptions in an argument. So to that end, let's dissect another argument. Once again, you may wish to pause this video and summarize the conclusion, premises, and assumption before continuing. Okay, let's begin with the conclusion. What is the author trying to convince us of with this argument? Some students will say that the conclusion is here. The wolves are not to blame for the decrease in the rabbit population. And other students will say that the conclusion is here. The decrease in the rabbit population is caused by the virus. Well, which one is it? In situations where it's difficult to locate the conclusion, you can always apply the premise, therefore, conclusion test. To apply this test, we examine the 2 different arrangements possible and see which ones make the most sense. When we do this, we get option A, the wolves are not to blame, therefore the virus caused the deaths. And we get option B, the virus caused the deaths, therefore the wolves are not to blame. As you can see, option B makes more sense. So the conclusion is that the wolves are not to blame, and the virus information is a premise that supports the conclusion. To summarize the conclusion, we might write something like this. Okay, now let's summarize the premises. First, we can take this part about the wolf relocation and summarize it as follows. Next, we can summarize this information like this. And finally, this last part can be something like this. So this is the basic structure of the argument. Now, can you identify any assumptions that are necessary to draw the conclusion? Well, for this argument, it might be difficult to spot a necessary assumption, and that's okay. Although it's useful to identify unstated assumptions, we should not spend too much time looking for them. Nevertheless, let's see if we can find one. We're told that the virus caused the deaths, but from this, can we naturally conclude that the wolves are not to blame? Not really. Perhaps the wolves brought the virus to the island, or perhaps the wolves' actions have caused the virus to flourish. In these cases, the wolves would be partially responsible. So an unstated assumption might be that the wolves did not somehow contribute to the existence of the virus on the island. This would be an assumption that is necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises. Okay, that's the argument. Now, before we examine another argument, let's look at a few tips to consider for identifying conclusions and premises. First, when looking for the conclusion of an argument, you should be aware of certain trigger words that indicate the presence of a conclusion. Therefore is a very common keyword, and here are some others to watch out for. Of course, there are many different ways for an author to present a conclusion without using any of these keywords, but the ones listed here are the most popular. You should also watch out for keywords that indicate the presence of a premise. These include the following words. Also, when looking for the conclusion of an argument, it helps to know the most common argument structures. The most common structure looks like this, where the conclusion appears at the very end of the passage, after the supporting premises. Another common structure is one where the conclusion appears at the beginning of a passage, and then the supporting premises appear afterwards. Given these two popular structures, you should be extra careful when reading the first and last sentences of a passage. And finally, there are times when the main passage does not even contain a conclusion. Instead, the conclusion appears in the question stem. Please note that these three structures are the most common structures. There are, of course, times when the conclusion appears somewhere in the middle of the passage, so watch out for that as well. It's also important to note that there are times when the passage does not contain a conclusion at all. For example, some argument passages provide you with premises only, and you must select a reasonable conclusion from the answer choices. Okay, now let's examine one last argument. You may wish to pause the video now so you can summarize the various components of this argument. As you can see, there's no conclusion in the main passage. Instead, the conclusion can be found here in the question stem. The conclusion is that releasing 100 dragonfish into Chilliwack Lake will allow the gigafish to survive. Now, as far as supporting evidence goes, we have this part where we are told that the gigafish used to be the only fish species in Chilliwack Lake. We'll summarize that here. Next, we're told that the Mervina fish were found in the lake last month. We can summarize this as follows. Then we're told that the Mervina fish survive by eating other fish, so we can summarize it this way. And finally, we're told that in other lakes, dragonfish limit the Mervina fish population by eating them. One way to summarize this is as follows. The basic structure of the argument looks something like this. Now, can you think of any unstated assumptions that are necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises? It seems to me that one big assumption is that the dragonfish won't eat the gigafish. Without this assumption, it's possible that the gigafish population could still disappear from the lake. We're also assuming that the dragonfish won't do something else to jeopardize the gigafish population. Another assumption is that 100 dragonfish will be sufficient to limit the Mervina fish population. Now, it's possible that there are many more assumptions, but instead of looking for them, I'll add an extra word of caution about assumptions. When it comes to deconstructing an argument, identifying assumptions is usually the hardest step, and if you get too caught up in this step, you can waste considerable time. Also note that there are many argument questions for which identifying the assumptions will not even help you answer the question. So although it's nice to identify the underlying assumptions in an argument, this step is not crucial. In almost all cases, you will still be able to answer the question. However, it may take a little longer if you have not identified any underlying assumptions. So I'll leave you with this. As you deconstruct and summarize an argument, be sure to watch out for any unstated assumptions, but don't let this slow you down to the point where it becomes detrimental to your timing. Okay, let's summarize. In this lesson, we learned some basic tips to help us deconstruct argument passages on the GRE into their basic components. Now it's time for some practice questions.